Rob, how you doing, sir?
All
Good to
right,
see
good,
you.
good. Thank you for having me here.
Hey, I'm super excited. I mean, you and I have connected. We connected a few years ago, and we have aligned interests. One around the balance between performance and well-being. You know, the
Mm.
idea that workers can just work 24/7 is not realistic. Obviously, the pandemic
But we're
has.
giving it a heck of a go, aren't we?
We're giving it a heck of a go. Dr. Jeffrey Pfeffer presented in one of our final in-person events here in San Francisco. He's, of course, the author of Dying for a Paycheck and many other books. And so he was talking about well-being. And fast forward a couple months later, we're in a pandemic,
Mhm.
and this focus on well-being was top of mind from a humanitarian perspective, but it
Mhm.
was also top of mind from, oh gosh, we're an organization, we got to get work done. So, how to right size the workforce and all this. So I am particularly interested in your research and your thoughts and ideas on how to manage this, both from an individual perspective as well as an organizational perspective. So before I go on my own long narrative here, you mind introducing yourself and elaborate more on what you're going to talk about today?
Sure, sure. Rob Cross. I teach at Babson College, and then a large part of my time is spent directing a group called the Connected Commons. So that's a consortium that's grown to about 110 organizations that really study different aspects of relationships and collaborations and impact on organizations at different levels. But the piece of work I'll talk about today is really almost about 20 years we've been focused on studying what I call successful people, people that are on the upward performance trajectory, but they're also scoring higher on measures of thriving, resilience, psychological well-being, other elements like that. And really trying to take the spin of what creates a high performer that's also sustainable today, given all the demands at us.
Absolutely love it. So I'll get out of your way. I know if you're listening, and I'm going to put this in the chat. We have Rob has a couple polls for you all to take as we go. So be prepared for that in the polls section. But for now, I'll step back.
Thank you for having me here, Al, obviously, and then everybody for participating. I would love to have people kind of play along, put questions into chat, or obviously the two polls that we'll go back to. But what I wanted to share, as I mentioned, was really a program of work we've had through the consortium involving ultimately over 300 companies on the analytics side that we've looked at, and then I've done a little bit over 600 interviews over the past 5 or 6 years. Trying to tease apart different aspects of how people connect in ways that seem to yield both performance and well-being. And I want to share a little bit of that and use the framework of my book I have coming out to do that. But when we started looking at, the relationship, you go out and map these really big network analytics and things that I've presented more at an organizational level with the group before. If we then focus not on the organizational or teams, but we actually look at the individuals in these networks and look to get separate performance data, right? Not assuming that people are self-rating or assuming that a big network is a good one or things like that, but look to get, whether it's revenue production, patent counts, rapid promotion, all sorts of things that we've played with across these organizations. It enables us to get a sense of how are people collaborating in ways that drive performance, right? In ways that are consistently associated with becoming and staying a high performer. And when we took that look, what we learned was there was a really striking tendency for them, what I call, again, the more successful people, right? They're high performers and, they're doing better, scoring higher on measures of just well-being, So I call them the happy people. But what we found is there was a great tendency for this group of people to be about 18 to 24% more efficient than their peers. And so a large body of work we focused on that I've written about in Harvard Business Review and other places, and it's the first piece of the book, is around understanding what those people are doing. Right? So we could define them analytically and see who are those people that are giving the greatest impact and taking the least amount of time. And then we could, I did go out and interview the heck out of those people. I started with 100 women and 100 men and rolled that into a series of other diagnostics to understand behaviorally how these people are, again, about a day a week more efficient than their peers. And it boils down to a set of things that I'd like to spend a little bit of time on around how these people put structure into their work. So they're much more likely to strategically calendar Friday night Monday, Friday night or Sunday night. Their block reflective time that manages to a rhythm work. They're much more likely to adapt role expectations rather than fall into a system. They are much more likely to define that system a little bit better. Two, they have a greater tendency to manage their own, what I call either beliefs or identity triggers, things that lead us to jump in when we shouldn't. And if anything has surprised me in this game, it's been the degree to which we are many, many times the heart of our own problem in this. And then third is a behavioral piece of it, right? And so you find the more efficient collaborators, it's not so much emails that kill us, it's the culture of use that a lot of times we allow to persist around spheres we can control. And the more efficient collaborators tend to do that differently. They kind of come at it from an idea that I can't control all email, but in the sphere I can control, I can actually buy back a lot of time if we just set different norms on when it's used, how long an email needs to be, things like that. And so we see very tactical things around how they run meetings, how they use email, how they manage workflows, things like that enable them to, in aggregate, get back a good chunk of time. And then the trick for me is, and not how do you buy that time back and just go faster, right? Because that's kind of what we're struggling with through COVID. We know going through here that people are working about 5 to 8 hours more a week, deeper into the night, earlier into the morning. And they've managed to create, for many of us, situations where we've gone for, 45-minute hour meetings down to just jamming more 30-minute meetings in. And it's exhausting, right? Because the intensity is higher in those meetings, your switching cost is greater, and just, you know yourself, every time you have a meeting, there's almost always some follow-up that's happening. So we've ratcheted up our work to try and accommodate this. And for me, the trick is not how do you buy back time to collaborate in the same way, but rather to understand what are those people doing that manage to start getting scale out of how they're collaborating with others. And I won't have enough time today to really go into that in great depth, but I do want to hit on one idea around the breadth of their networking and the way that provides them scale, and then what I see with the people on the bottom here that are doing better from a well-being standpoint. But to start with the collaborative overload work, what we can see is that people that tend to do better in this game, they're much more likely to put structure into their work. And if there's one idea I would, tattoo on everybody's forehead as much as possible, is to play offense, not defense. In this game. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. One of the fascinating things to me as we moved into COVID was I was part of different survey efforts and a whole series of different consortium where these surveys were going out to lots and lots of organizations. And I was able to get many of them just to put an open-ended question at the end of it to say, what are you learning? Right, from this experience, what's your experience in addition to all the closed items, right, that we statistically analyze. And for those of you that have done this, you do something like that and it may go out to hundreds of organizations, but you get just a couple of pages back typically, right, because it's not for your organization or things like that. We were getting hundreds of pages back on that question. I was like a kid in a candy store, because you'd read through this and they'd be really kind of thoughtful responses around ways that people were kind of experiencing this pretty dramatic shift, right, in life. And what amazed me is that I would go through these responses and I would see really kind of thoughtful responses. Thank God I don't have my commute anymore, right? I'm getting back 2.5 hours a day. I'm speaking to my significant other. I'm healthier. My kids like me. It was like I've been able to kind of secure more time to kind of reclaim my life. And then I would get almost the exact polar opposite response in these things that said, oh my gosh, where did my commute go? Right? It was the only time I had to think. There's more emails, meetings flooding in on me. I can't keep up anymore. And the reality is, for that second group, that it wasn't so much the commute, right? It was that they gave up control of the situation. They allowed things to come in and they started playing defense and not offense. And that's really at the heart of this game, from my standpoint, is finding ways on the margin. I call this game more of a brawl than a ballet. It's not going to be one elegant solution, but I find the people that are persistent and focused on how do they proactively, shield against demands, how they kind of proactively shape the context they're in, they do better. And not just from a performance standpoint, but all the, 200 interviews I just finished on the well-being side shows the same thing there. So on the imposed structure piece, I thought I'd tell you a story that weaves throughout the book of somebody named Scott. So this isn't his real name, and I'll kind of disguise the industry and story so I don't get in trouble on it. That's not Scott either, but he's a real person. And I had been involved with my team in a major life sciences organization. We were mapping network analytics across the top 10,000, right? So that's a game where time to market is really critical. And they had done all sorts of structural things to speed decision-making and locate, decision rights. And what they were finding is what's common is culture was beating structure, right? When people didn't get an answer they liked, they just went and found somebody else that gave an answer they wanted, and it wasn't working. And so we were using the network analytics to see how do we speed time to market. And as a byproduct of that, I had heard about this guy, Scott, forever. In the early stages of what we were doing. And he had been brought into the organization, not done anything major for the first 3 or 4 years. And then he was put on a new product development effort that because of that win and then derivative wins, right off of that, it became a major blockbuster for this organization. If I mentioned the name, everybody would get it. And he flew up the hierarchy, right? And it progressively over a 15, 16-year period until when I came in contact with him, he was running this group behind him of about 1,800 people and 2 other groups that were a little smaller. But I'd heard generally nothing but positive things, right, about this individual. And so I was floored when I'm walking with the CEO to go into the boardroom to present on some of the things they could do to speed time to market. And he said, I'd like you to look at Scott because we're about to, they weren't going to fire him, but they were going to move him into a different role. And he said, it's a real mystery to us because he is, doing everything we can see that is right? He's taken layers out of the hierarchy. Very servant-based mindset, very responsive. And yet all of these things don't seem to be working, right? His engagement scores in his team are going down. He's missing growth opportunities. His peers are grumbling about him, et cetera. And so he's had the presence of mind to say, I wonder if it's in the network, right? Because typically the way organizations look at a leadership failure is they don't think about, gosh, could it be the network? Could it be the way they're collaborating doesn't scale, right? They look at the individual and say they weren't ready yet. And that person gets stigmatized and likely, moves on. But he had the presence to say, gosh, I wonder if we could look at this information and see, is there something there? And it turned out when we looked at it that he had, 118 people coming to him frequently for information, another 78 that said if they couldn't get more of his time, they can't hit their business goals. And this was 1 group out of 3, right? And so you could see that it wasn't sustainable. Right. The ways that he'd been collaborating that had been sustainable at certain levels weren't working at this next level. And it's really common to see these transition points be pretty significant failures because of the collaborative aspects, of the role. So what he did, and it's very common, very easy thing to do. He had a coach, but he don't need one. He was looking back 4 months in his calendar and scanning quickly through meetings, emails, and headers on decisions that were being made. And he's looking for the small things. And this is the thing with this for me is if you are overwhelmed and you look for the one big thing you can get rid of, you are conditioned to, only give it to the person you trust the most, right? And so you delegate, but you delegate to the next most busy person and you create another point of overload in the system. If you do it differently and you look for that, 18, 20, 24% of interactions that have just kind of crept around you and you're getting pulled into things that you don't need to be a part of anymore. All of them individually seem small and you answer anyway. And you don't really see the cumulative effect of that until you do something like this, right? But he was able to locate kinds of information that he could shift to somebody else to be a go-to person. And he wasn't giving it to the next most busy person. He was looking 2 layers down in the network. And so he was helping pull talent that he wanted into the group at the same time of taking demands off of him. You do this real easily with looking at information, decisions that you're being pulled in portions of role. You look back 4 months and then you look forward to say where the routine standing meetings, right, consuming too much time, and can you shrink those, send other people, or increase the space between them? And he got about 18% of his time back by looking at things structurally. Then he stepped back and said, okay, how am I the enemy? Right? What am I doing that's causing the problem? And for him, it was this desire to help. Right. And a lot of times people see these networks and they see leaders that get into these overwhelmed positions, and the knee-jerk reaction we all have is that's a control freak, right? They're not willing to let go. And yet what I see is it's driven by all sorts of tendencies. Some people love accomplishment, so they jump in quickly. Some people are scared, right, of saying no and what the impression is going to be. For Scott, it was just he deeply believed leadership was about helping. But the more that you see and try to help directly, of course, the more you become the path of least resistance on things, and it creates demands ultimately that people can't keep up with. So they did something I didn't know was possible with him. They sent him to this health retreat camp because physically he was worn out. I would get emails at 3 a.m., 6 a.m., and you could see he wasn't healthy. But the key thing they did in that is they took his devices away. Right? So he wasn't, and I mean that plural, wasn't able to take both of them. And he describes that scenario like a heroin withdrawal, right, or something like that, jokingly, when we're in the sessions we do for the organization. And we know that's not too far off the truth, right? We get these hits that kind of entrain us to keep checking and keep looking. But he got through the 10 days, and day 11, of course, he was right back on email because he was going to get caught up. And to him, the most amazing thing is he would see these threads that happened 10 days ago. He would viscerally feel his blood pressure, rising, his body reacting, saying, I've got to jump in, only to find, that 2 or 3 emails later, everything was solved, right? And so his tendency to jump in, coming from a great place, right? Desire to help. I got to make sure my team knows I'm here, I'm engaged, I'm with them, would not only cause problems in the moment because suddenly people were managing Scott and the issue, right? But it would come back in the way of more and more meetings over time as well. And he realized the degree to which, he'd seen the enemy, it was him. And so he sat down and focused on a set of things behaviorally that he could do as well around kind of not jumping in, not, making comments on plans or ideas unless he could get greater than 25% impact. And ultimately, he was able to move himself from the number 1 overloaded person in about 6 months to number 17 and then to number 23 by the end of the year. And the idea, wasn't to get him out of everything, but to position his involvement in a way that both optimized his effectiveness, but also had the greatest impact on the organization. And so what I see in this is both of these elements, right? How we're putting structure into our world, and then how we're managing our own triggers, this tendency to jump in, like a desire to help, are kind of hidden aspects of overload that we don't think about a lot. But what I wanted to do was think about this with everybody as a group and see if we could do a quick poll here. So when we look at how people put structure right into their worlds and go through all the interviews and then the quantitative analytics, it boils down to about 8 things that seem to have the biggest impact, right? Clarity on strengths you want to deploy in your work, blocking reflective time, periodically reviewing calendar and email trails to kind of streamline roles, a set of things like that. And what I thought we would do as a group is see if I could ask people to come take the poll, and identify the single one of these 8 that if you did more systematically could have the greatest impact for you. So Al, I'm going to turn this back to you if I can, and see if we can just kind of play along with the poll here for a second.
Yeah, I just put a note in the chat. If you're here, please go over to the polls section on the right-hand bar, and you'll see polls, and you'll see it live. And we'll give you, 40 seconds to read and look at the options and make your selections.
And do you need me to do anything here, Al, to stop sharing my screen for a second?
Nope.
Okay, so I'll rely on you to tell me a couple highlights of what you're seeing, because I can't see anything.
Actually, Rob, you could probably go over to, can you see the right side of your screen or no? If not.
Not unless I go off.
Okay. You see the polls? We can go there. The responses are just coming in. If you go back, how about this? You just go back to your slides and I'll give you some highlights. Does that work?
Okay, that sounds good.
So I'm going to read the options. Which one of the following means to impose structure can have the greatest effect on you. Number one, clarity on strengths I want to employ in my work and values I want to live through my career. The second option, I proactively initiate network connections important to my professional and personal success. Third, I strategically schedule time for collaborations important to my professional and personal goals. I block time in my calendar for reflective work. I periodically review my calendar and email. And lastly, I proactively shape others' expectations of my role to streamline collaborative demands. The responses are still coming in. The one that is getting the most response right now is I strategically schedule time for collaborations important to my professional and personal goals. And that's tied with I block time on my calendar for reflective work, which I personally have started employing in my own life.
Yeah. Well, I'll kind of comment on those too. And then I'd love to hear, if we give it a little bit more time, if it's a roughly even distribution across all of these, or if all of them have been selected, just as a final thought. But I'll grab the block time in calendar. It was interesting to me. That's become a big deal as people have been showing that kind of 2-hour blocks, is almost a linear relationship with productivity in certain kinds of work, right? But what's amazing to me is that we don't think about a lot is the cost of disruptions. And I ended up writing a lot about that in my book, that the cognitive psychologists show that the act of just looking down at a text and back up can be as much as a 64-second loss to get back on track. And a lot of studies have been done that show that if you engage off the task you were doing to such a degree that you lose your train of thought, that it can take up to 23 minutes to kind of recapture those things that were just a little bit in the ether that you were starting to kind of pull together. And so you just think about all the disruptions you have, whether it's, text, calls, emails, things that you allow to kind of pop in through a day, and you start adding that up, and it can become quite a bit of time that's lost just because of the disruptions that we don't really think about that way. And so what I would hear is, people not just blocking time, in the sense of 2-hour blocks, but they were much more attuned to managing to their rhythm of work. Right. Mm-hmm. So some people will tell me through all these interviews, the first thing I do is email right in the morning. I try to get that out of the way. And then I'd go interview the next person. They'd say, have you lost your mind? Why would I start with email? Why would I let other people start my day? Right. I'm going to start with the creative ideas, and I'm going to get to email in 30-minute blocks or something like that through the day. I'm going to communicate it to others. They know when to hear from me. And I'm going to kind of manage things that way. That's a good strategy to reflect on, because many people find that if they try to start with email, they keep getting up earlier and earlier, and they still never get to their creative work, right? Because email tends to beget email. And it would even be more than that. Like, people would tell me that, I try to put my most creative or innovative thinking time at the end of a day on a Friday, right? And to me, I was thinking, gosh, that's when you are ready to go home, right? Or hit the gym or the bar or whatever you're doing. And they would say, no, I find that I'm not thinking about it all weekend, but I come back on Monday and I've got an idea or two, right? And so it's that kind of way that I see people kind of being proactive, you know what I mean? And kind of managing to a rhythm. They're scattering interactions that energize them on the strategically calendaring for collaborations. They're much more holistic on the set of connections they're thinking about and building into their calendar. There's certainly short-term objectives, but then there's developmental objectives they're thinking about. There's kind of personal, priorities, whether it's around health or friendships or whatever our goals are on that front. And I think that's could not be more important as we go forward. And I think, part of the reason we're struggling through the pandemic is the workloads have risen, but it's all happened at the exact same time that we've been pulled out of all these groups that kept us sane to begin with. Our music, athletic groups, religious groups, book clubs, whatever, that kind of went away. And I think people, now more than ever, because we're not relying on physical space or other things to kind of form our interactions as much, they need to be intentional, right, on how they're doing those things as well. But I'm curious if you have the polls in there, do you see a rough distribution there, or can you comment on that?
It is a pretty equitable distribution. I actually have a question, if I might just jump in on this, because I in what you just shared, and I'm going to be selfish for a second and reflect on my own personal life. I proactively shape others' expectations of my role to streamline collaborative demand. Did not get any votes. However, I have tried to do that. I have tried to communicate that I do need this reflective time, that there are certain boundaries that I need to maintain when I'm working with 17 other people. That, hey, I'm not going to be immediately responsive, that I am going to have to, if you're going to reach out to me via Teams, then this is kind of the reason to do that. I can't just constantly be reactive, to external demands or unexpected demands. Is that what you're trying to get at with
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a piece of it. And I think that's the trick in this game is like how you decide to put structure in. And I hear great stories of success, for example, with people that did this 30-minute idea and they communicate to their team about here's, when you can get to me and when not. So that's definitely a piece of it. And I find, generally speaking, and I talk with so many people about this stuff now, that people try to respect, work kind of adapts around you a lot more than we think sometimes. We're absolutely sure it won't, but it's amazing how it does when we let it. But then it also is, it's subordinates, right, that are coming to you for help on something. And it would be quicker to just tell them an answer. But we find the people that do better say, so that you don't have to come back to me next time and waste your time. Let me show you how this is done. Right. Or they're, taking them back down and they're signaling in a very positive way that this is really something you should be figuring out. Here's how to do it. They're building capability, nothing negative, right, about it. Or, you hear like one of the biggest problems that most people are having today is what I call priority overload. It's the demands coming into the team with all these flatter organizations we've created. It's supposedly a great thing for innovation and enterprise leadership and all that, but it creates an overwhelm on teams that sometimes first level leaders or even managers of managers, they're not really equipped to kind of say no, because they haven't said it to that point. And, I see really simple things that people pull out this impact to effort grid when they get an ask and they say, where does this fit on impact to effort? And if it's like a lot of effort and low impact, can we just talk about what else we could do here? You know what I mean? So they're not saying no, and they're not being aggressive in that ask for somebody that's more senior, but they're figuring out a way to talk about it and balance things, right? Or other people right now are really doing a great job of, if they have 3 or 4 stakeholders that are driving work for them or their teams, they've created these forums that kind of get that work out in front of everybody. And then they draw a line and say, here's what we can feasibly accomplish. You guys prioritize. You know what I mean? Or they're putting it back on them. So there's a whole suite of subtle ways that people are doing this, I guess.
If you don't mind if we stay on this for a little bit, because there's 2 things that are jumping to mind that are really concerning, but they're also huge opportunities. Number one is when we talk about empathy, servant leadership, focusing on well-being, like holding space for somebody as a leader or a colleague, saying, hey, how you doing? And now you're empathizing, you're staying in curiosity, you're being compassionate, all those things. However, you're taking energy and time to do that. And if you're having those interactions repeatedly, yes, there is a benefit there, but there's also a trade-off in terms of time, and productivity. So do you have any, coaching on how to balance that reality of being fully present and connected with another human being and just getting to work?
Yeah, I think I can tell you where we're going with this. And this is, a whole other book that I'm just putting into play and, proposal stage right now, but it's on the well-being work directly, around relationally. What do we, and I'll mention a little bit of this at the end of the presentation, but we've learned a tremendous amount around what I call micro stressors, the way all these relational touch points create stress for us through the day that is kind of invisible to us. You know what I mean? It's a disagreement you sense with somebody. It's a text from your child. It's all these small things that we just get used to fighting through. And we in the day work through 20, 25, 30 of them. We're exhausted and we can't quite put our finger on what just happened, right? Because they accumulate, around us. And so you need to do things that buffer against that. or adapt that, isolate where they're coming from and adapt it. And then you need to do things that pull you into connections that help you rise above some of the stress. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So what I believe we need to get to are team level solutions on this. And that's how we're building, the tools for the consortium. I think it's a totally losing strategy to continue to force so many demands on leaders today. Yep. And I see it in situations like that. I will never forget, it was interview 195, I think, on this well-being work, and a very successful, very polished woman that was running a group of 1,000 and very well-known consulting firm. I'm not going to mention any names in this whatsoever. And this was going through 10 interviews, interviewed 5 women, 5 men in each organization on this that were supposedly their top performers. And as I went through the interviews in that specific organization, it was very clear that their operating model had created roles that were not feasible, right, by any standards of physics, because they're not looking at the collaborative footprint of the work. They're just kind of saying, oh, this is going to make us a networked organization and we're going to sell more and all that. But this one woman in particular, it'll stick with me till the day I die. She's, first 15 minutes, you're like talking to somebody that you're like, wow, this is amazing. Like, look what this person's doing. And then you find out that just had the third child, they're in an apartment right in Washington, D.C., can't find time to feed the baby, let alone pump for the baby, right? And you're like, wow, and so you get the impact of that decision, right? The impact has already been made with the child in the apartment not to feed the child for savings of 10 minutes or whatever it is, right? I'm not going to profess to be an expert on that. Yeah, right. But it's that level of stuff that I've been going through in all these 200 interviews recently, where you're like, it's not feasible, to keep foisting more and more on people, especially leaders. And so I think it's got to be situated in the teams. And I think what I'm proposing are these tool sets that actually create paired relationships within the team and distribute that a little bit to make that work.
Well, thank you for sharing. And I know you have more slides, but there's one question that is just too perfect to let go based on what you just shared. And it's the notion of workforce planning. So if we look at the work and we look at people who are overloaded with work, and we say, you know what, they need less work. So now we're going to right size the amount of work and collaboration that's going to happen within that work. So now what do we have? We have a bunch of work left over, and that has to get done by somebody or something. So that work can get done by more employees. They can get done by contractors, consultants, outsource providers, robotic automation, depending on the nature of the work, of course. But at the end of the day, arguably, there's going to be more people involved. There's going to be additional expense. And so finance has largely driven headcount planning, and there's been cost constraints on the amount of investment an organization can put forth towards workers, towards people. Is the solve at the end of the day right-sizing the work and hiring more people?
So I think it could be, and I think like when I'm doing a top leadership thing for one of the biggest law firms, right, in the world, and they were like citing the fact that, oh my gosh, our revenue per attorney is dropping. Now these people are already wealthy beyond belief, right? Yeah. But they're focused on how do we squeeze more out, just because they're looking at those tables. And we're falling behind, right? And you look at that, and the same thing with all the investment banks, right? That I talk to these people, they're literally killing. This 138-year-old that was having chest pains, right? Yeah. And not doing well. So my point in this is, I think there's an element of that, right? I think at the heart of it, there's an element of people needing to think about, do we need more people, right, to execute this work? And is that kind of morally the right thing, or do we keep trying to, drive riches to the top? But I also think that there is a huge proportion of this that is just embedded in us never looking analytically at the collaborative demands that are in the system. So task A and task B, they look the same, or a given role looks the same as another role in terms of the actual workload. But if one requires you to coordinate with 2 people that are in the same geography, and the other requires you to work across 3 time zones with 2 people that don't like each other. And I'm just making this up. The footprint, the collaborative footprint of the work is much greater, right, in one area than the other. We don't look at that. All the consulting firms come through and they say, we'll make you a network-centric organization, or the technology firms are piling on tools. And nobody is actually looking at the inefficiencies of the collaboration. So that idea that I just mentioned to you around, if you have 4 or 5 stakeholders coming at you and you can feasibly do it, you kind of get this forum out there that says, for each stakeholder, here's what you've asked me to do, right? Little cards that are up there virtually, draw lines, say here's what the team can do. It's stunning the number of people that have done that and then force the interaction amongst the stakeholders, and they figure out how to get what they need once they see what each other's asking.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And so that's an inefficiency, because we're not analytically looking at what we're doing to people that may not need more workers at the end of the day. It's just that we haven't been disciplined about how we collaborate. And just to give you the degree to which I think that's insane, we can track expenses down to 2 decimal places, on anything in this financial.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, we have, most people on this call would probably say I spend 85% or more of my week on collaborative work, emails, meetings, phone calls, responding to documents I have to add to. And we know nothing about that. Like, very few companies actually track that to see kind of, are we doing this well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't know, how much of that would require more workers and how much of it could actually be accomplished by being better at this, right, and not just hearing the word collaboration and saying, yes, I need more of it, kind of thing.
Well, thank you for that. And if we keep up this track record, I'm not going to let you get through the slides.
Yeah.
I'm going to disappear again. We might have to skip that second poll, Rob, if you don't.
Yeah, no, totally good. Totally good.
And,
you're going to guide me.
All right, sounds good. I'll get out of your way and let you continue, though. Thank you.
Okay,
super fascinating and helpful.
Good deal. So as I was saying, the first piece of this is how people put structure into their work, and hopefully even in some of the subtle things that I'm kind of outlining, what I hope people will recognize is that many times we have more control than we think we do in situations. And, and the reality is we've never had more ability to shape what we do and who we do it with in any point in history, but there is a tendency to feel like we don't have it. Right. And that we're kind of locked in this pattern. And what I can see is the people that do better, don't fall into that. Right. Not on everything. Right. What they're looking for is on the margin. Right. The smaller things that they can control. Then the second thing for me that really kind of floored me in all this is that the more efficient collaborators are more keenly aware of these triggers that lead them to jump in when they shouldn't, right? And so when I started this work, I was completely convinced that the enemy was going to be all about, emails, meetings, time zones, demanding clients, right? That was going to be the enemy. And as I came out the other end, through all the interviews, and I won't take the time to kind of walk through that in depth, but it became really clear to me that 50% or more of the problem is us. And kind of how we see a situation and think we need to jump in a certain way, and that leads to these patterns of interaction that accumulate. Sometimes they are across time, in a way. So when Scott, the person I was describing earlier, would jump in, a lot of time it was good, well-intentioned, right? I need to show my team I'm present, I'm with them, I'm here to help. Right, it wasn't hoarding, but he would jump in, make a comment, and then suddenly the team that was involved in that piece of work were suddenly bifurcated. They were managing the issue and they were managing Scott, and then he would be pulled into meetings sometimes 4 or 6 weeks later, and other interactions that really all stem back from that jumping in. Like, and he never made the correlation, right, between being busy at 6 weeks out and what he did in that micro moment. But when we look at that, I could see that people make these choices in terms of how they're collaborating, and that overload would happen in kind of 2 different ways. One is when you're promoted, right, or when a piece of work comes at you and you just jump in, right, to get things done. And those to me were less of an issue, right, because they tended to have a finite beginning and ending point that you could kind of say, okay, this is going to get better. Right. And as long as you stuck to it and didn't just kind of, make that the new normal as you went through. What was more troubling to me, and the people that I would talk to that had allowed everything to fall out of their lives, which I think is really critical to well-being. People I can see that are much happier today, statistically, and just talking to them, they tend to maintain at least 2 and usually 3 groups outside of work that they're engaging with. It broadens their identity. It helps them rise above the minutiae of work. When you start to lose that dimensionality in your life, then you start to overreact, right, to the minutiae. And it starts to become, a more and more defining characteristic of your identity and stress. And what I would see with people is we can see this, physically, right? People tend to get less healthy starting mid-30s. They're falling out of the groups that kind of kept them engaged in activities that were taking care of themselves. They're less sense of purpose in some ways if they're kind of falling out of groups that kept them. And the way I would see that is it would be kind of this slow incremental, absorption into work, right? Deeper into the night, earlier in the morning, a little bit later into the weekend. And it all felt good is the crazy thing, right? You feel like you're in the thick of things. That's the seductive thing about overload. It feels good right up until it doesn't, right? You feel like people count on you and you're important, and eventually right up until your significant other says no more, right? Or a health issue comes along, or you lose a key employee, or just that one final project was one too many. And it oftentimes starts a downward spiral because a lot of times the overwhelmed people, they've been engaging in a way that doesn't create followership around them, right? They've been firefighting from point A to point B and not thinking about how do I create projects and work, or how do I shape projects and work that engage others. And it's just a negative thing. And so I'll make available a diagnostic that we've built. I put it out there in one of the HBRs already that people can go through. But what we see is that people, tend to fall into these tendencies to jump in the micro moment, right? Because they love accomplishment, or they like to be influential, right? Or they like to help, or they're scared about being labeled a poor performer, or think they need to be right versus someone who can find an answer. And I feel like for that group, the colleges and the high schools have really killed us there. Like we've created these systems where the people that get the best grades are really sharp and present in the moment. They're not the people that kind of figure things out quickly. And really, we need more of those figure out quickly people to not create so much pressure on things and organizations. But if you take a look at the diagnostic, what you're trying to think about is, the last time you got asked to do something and you knew with every fiber of your being you shouldn't do it, right? Yet in that next second, you convinced yourself of all the reasons you should go do this thing. And you end up overwhelmed 6 weeks later. Right? What is that tendency, right? And you're looking to kind of guard against that trigger. And then the last piece is around just the behavioral, the side of this. Again, a lot of efficiencies that can be claimed on the margin, right? You're not going to solve email, for example, but gosh, if you could streamline 60% of it such that you're getting back, 40 minutes a day, is that worth it? And it absolutely is, right? And the way that's what we see with these people is that they're much more kind of dogmatic on one idea in each of these spheres. That tends to be the difference. And then it's how they spend the time. And so let me very quickly move through here so I can save time for any kind of discussion and Q&A on this. But the biggest thing that we see on how people are investing the time, and this is kind of the second half of the book, so I'm not doing it justice. One is that it's never a big network that distinguishes high performer. It's always this structurally diverse network. It's the people that have more bridging ties into different pockets of an organization that tend to be more innovative. They tend to be producing things at scale that distinguishes them in pretty significant ways. And so I use the Kevin Bacon example a lot because Kevin's central in the movie universe, not because of the number of films per se, but generally it's the number of genres, right? He has more bridging ties across the genres, whereas somebody like a Jim Carrey, most of his connections tend to be within comedy, maybe drama as well. And so we know Kevin's network, it's the second biggest predictor of a high performer. It really started with a scholar by the name of Ron Burt that found this idea out. And what I've tried to extend with that notion is looking at how people create diversity in the network across time zones. And what I could see through all these interviews is that the high performers, they have a much greater tendency to manage networks across 3 time horizons. And I'm going to kind of go around this quickly, but one is the short term. So these small moments when you just see somebody on LinkedIn or you see them on a video conference and this idea hits you, right? Or you have somebody ask you for a piece of work when you've already got 8 things on your plate. There's a tendency for the high performers to have bought back just enough time that they're reaching into their network quickly to see, how could I do something more significant with this? Or they're capitalizing on those small moments rather than hunkering down. And they tend to do this by virtue of how they capitalize on the moments and how they generate serendipity. There's a way that they build kinds of connections around their projects that really matter, right? And so when I look at the networks, a lot of times people are just thinking about power, or do we have the Dartmouth people connected with the Dartmouth people? What I'm more focused on is around the 3 or 4 core activities you have going on. Have you built a certain set of connections, a certain specific set of connections that we know matter? And then third, on the long term, these people are really disciplined in making sure that they're exploring. No matter how busy they get, they are preserving time to explore possibilities and synergies over time. And that's really critical. That's the easiest thing to quit doing, but when you're busy, right, and overwhelmed. But the only way that you respond in the short-term moments, the micro moments, with a bigger idea is if you have a sense of what other capabilities are there, right? And how do you kind of package that set of capabilities in a way that pulls you into work that you want to be doing. So really easy grid, and I'll pass this on to, we do this with a lot of people. It's in the slide deck. It's just take a minute or two. You think about work you're trying to get done and where you should be building connections in these categories. These are the kinds of connections that we know statistically predict the high performers, and they are the ones that are creating diversity in the network that matter. Latter thing I'll say is on the bottom part of that grid, we also see that that's the well-being piece for me, right? And we look at it in 3 different ways here. One is what I've seen in all these interviews that we've done, as well as a lot of the quantitative analytics, is that the decision to become healthy, right? If you're at this point in your life where you're just not as healthy as you want, whether that means activity, nutrition, whatever it means, usually that is sustainable if you embed that decision in a group somehow, right? And you kind of engage with others around that thing. You make the goals public. You do things that are, maybe like what a Weight Watchers does or other people in terms of creating social accountability. But what I think is being missed in a lot of this through all these interviews that I went through is when you do that well with a group and you're interacting with that group, even if it's just going for a walk, or if it's deciding you want to do a marathon, or you just want to eat, more nutrition, kind of oriented lifestyle, is you start interacting with people that come at the world from different places, right? It starts bringing a different element of diversity and perspective into your life. The connections, particularly if it's a physical activity, become authentic, right? Because you're sometimes pushing each other, and it creates a dimension in your life, right? That again, kind of broadens you from more than work. So we see people that do that well. We see people that connect in a way that gives them a sense of purpose. And I know that's a huge idea out there, and it has been for a while, but people have generally said, I want to look at purpose as the work, right? If I can just get this meaningful work, then I'll be okay. And what I've been more focused on is, how do people create purpose as a product of the kinds of interactions they're having at work? Because I've been in a ton of organizations that do really boring stuff, and yet they can be, greatest place to work's top rated places, some of them. And then other places that have meaningful work like you wouldn't believe, yet they're just unhappy, right? And a lot of it, again, isn't the work, it's the way people are kind of engaging with others at work. And then we can see spheres outside of work that also matters. So if you get a moment, you have a time to kind of process this grid, a little bit deeper, play along with me and take 100 points and say, how am I placing my bets right now? Right? Where am I placing all my bets in terms of how I get a sense of purpose? And then the idea for me is not to say I need to go out and find out how to solve world hunger, right? Or do, something magnificent. The idea for me is, what if I just shifted one thing I was doing that pulled me into more spheres, right? And so maybe it's, instead of running to beat this personal 10K time, I start running with my child, their friend, and a parent, right? And it's still getting exercise, but I'm not allowing society and my ego to define kind of what I'm going after. I'm actually looking at the value I get from the connections as well. And we see a lot of really cool ways that people, very busy people, are able to do that. And then the last question is around resilience, right? Who do you have around you that provides a source of resilience? And this is a piece for HBR we did recently, where same idea with purpose, right? With resilience, we're being told by constant sources that we have grit, right? Or we have toughness, or resilience is something we own. Yet if you really look how people get through difficult stretches in all this well-being work, you can see that they tend to fall back on others in 8 pretty predictable ways, right? To get perspective in a situation, to get empathy, to see a path forward, to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. And the people that have built those connections, they do better, right? If you've built them. If you haven't built them, then it is really grit, right? And it's just you kind of going through it. But this is a great thing to kind of reflect on, number one, to say what's important to you, right? Because it differs for people. Some people want empathy, some people want laughter. And then number two is, are you building that in, right? So when you get a chance, it takes no more than 5 or 10 minutes, whip through this grid and say, okay, the top is work related, bottom, are these really very consistent drivers on well-being that we can see matter, and just plot some people in there and see, what would it take in terms of slight shifts that could have the greatest impact. So that's what I wanted to walk through, right? Is to give a sense of what I can see, again, what I call the successful people are doing. They're the people that are performing well and scoring high on measures of well-being, in the ways that they're, kind of pushing back on the system to reclaim time, and then investing that time in connections differently. So Al, let me turn it back to you if I can, and we can ask Q&A or whatever you would like to do.
Yeah, Rob, thank you so much. I mean, I cannot think of another concept or vein of insight that adds more value to the individual, as well as to the small group or team, as well as the organization. It requires like a self-awareness, but also some other centeredness to understand what's happening with other people. So, thank you not only for the insight, but for the tools in which to deal with it. So here's my my question, and we have limited time, but we can go a little past the top of the hour.
Okay.
If that's all right with you.
Yeah.
Is that we're not taught this. We're not taught this in our educational experience. We're not taught, as a parent, I give myself a C generously in terms of how I have educated my kids. But, we're dealing with new technologies. Obviously, our phones, distraction, the means in which we can get interrupted. So what is your advice to organizations to create a set of, for lack of a better term, educational experiences, so the level of self-awareness can be elevated, so people can take care of themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And to me, what in all of this, right, and in the ways we're pushing on the well-being stuff as well, we tend to be defaulting a lot to very good practices around mindfulness. Right. So they're fantastic things, meditation, journaling, whatever you're doing. But at the heart of them, what they're doing is enabling people to persist in the system they've built, rather than to say, how do I adapt this in a way that either takes some of the demands off me, shields me from the micro stresses, but also allows me to engage in a way that I rise above some of this, in a different ways. So I, of course, I'm the boy with the hammer, right? I think it's very important, in this. And what we're doing, like with the collaborative overload work, we're just about to deploy. We've deployed diagnostics and things people can take, but it's this online virtual card sort activity that people can say, okay, there's 25 of these practices. How do I get one in each area? And then we're, using nudges more and more, and trying to embed that behavior in a relationship, right? So they share their card with somebody that they're going to focus on that thing with. It sounds silly, right? But I think that's kind of the trick to this, is finding those small nudges. First of all, the reason I was asking you to tell me about the distribution of the poll there was because everybody and their cousin, every time I do one of these collaborative overload talks, they'll say, this is all great, but tell me the one thing I need to do, right? What's the one principle? And if I do an HBR. What's the one thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Seductive, sexy, counterintuitive. And I've got one, but the reality is everybody needs to get to their thing, right? And that's what you see in those distributions is you need to get down to 3 things through the diagnostic, through the card sort, whatever you're doing, that you then kind of persist on. And that I believe is best accomplished with some nudges as reminders for people. And then, getting a buddy, right? Yep. So you're kind of doing it together. So I think that on the micro level, that's the kinds of things that we're doing on a lot of these tools these days. I think at the macro level, I think people are not stupid or as hard as we think. I just think they haven't had the analytics to see it. Every time I've done a network analysis and I come back and I show people, in leadership positions that the design, the operating model they have deployed is not humanly possible to do, they start paying attention, right? But we just haven't had the analytics in place to make, good choices. And so I think that's it's got to get better somehow because people are, dying, as Jeff Pfeffer is saying.
Yeah,
it's really true.
It's a real deal, and the trend has not been good pre-COVID, and now that we're coming out into this return to workplace or hybrid work, I would hate for us to not have had some valuable learnings and improve. I mean, there's everything from 3 hours in the office and talking about 4.5 day work weeks. At the same time, people are working 60, 70, 8 hours a week. And so, the disconnect between intention and reality is pretty stark still. And so we'll see what happens, over the coming months and years, because obviously this is not going to get solved, like that. In fact, it might be a generational shift where, younger people come up and say,
no, right.
No.
I've got one of those.
Yeah.
Desperately trying to learn and pay attention.
Well, it's an interesting question because I often say I grew up in the suck it up generation. You're lucky to have a job. That's just the way it is. Just do it. Do what you're told. And increasingly high value talent, and as scarcity of talent increases, they're going to have options, and arguably they're going to go to employers where the experience is more humane, where they're going to be appreciated, and their constraints, their very human constraints of capacity are going to be acknowledged. So it could very well be a source of competitive advantage to gain this insight.
I think so, and I think I won't mention the name of the companies, but there's a whole set of them that are really focused on this well-being work with me and saying kind of, how do we do this? How do we help people see these relational drivers of stress and kind of craft contexts that, allow them to engage differently? And what I think is cool, number one, they're doing it for moral reasons. I think that's probably the biggest reason. But the reality is there's a really strong reason to believe that if you could get people to do some of this better, the number of people going into clinical categories of depression and the cost of that in organizations, would go significantly down. And kind of the orientation of this work with this group as we refine and test this out is, gosh, what if, we had a vision of people becoming better people when they were here, and could we kind of hold that and do things differently with these ideas that do that? So it's funny because I'm kind of coming down the back nine of my career and the things on this and then diversity, equity, inclusion that we've been able to kind of focus on with this lens is really, I think, inspiring. We'll kind of see what we take away.
100%. It's inspiring. And Rob, again, I'm honored that you've taken the time to share. I mean, you keep up the awesome work. And just for the record, further past hole 10, my friend. Okay, so you got a ways to go. No, but keep up the great work. Hey, Peyton, I see your comment. I'll get to you, personally, but again, I want to say thank you again, Rob. How can people learn more about you and follow your work?
Connected Commons is a great place to just kind of see what we're doing, and certainly, check that out. And I've really tried to do a much better job over the past year in revising my website so that we're feeding kind of all the research in there. So I would definitely check that out. And we've put, like 20, 30 white papers up in all these programs that are there for everybody, right? We kind of run it like an open source community. So So those would be two good places.
And get your book.
Oh yeah, please, yeah.
So,
and not just one, buy one for your kids.
Yeah,
at a certain level, you get steak knives, and I say,
good idea. All right, my friend, you be well. Thanks again.